Communities in various parts of the country have been ravaged by floods and wildfires, which have led to destruction of property and loss of several lives. Even with the presence of forecasters and climatologists, why are we always so hard hit by disasters? What exactly is the nature of the relationship between disaster management agencies and climatologists, as well as environmentalists, and how does it impact our disaster management efforts? Now, joining us is the director at the Alliance for Collaboration on Climate and Earth Systems Science, Dr. Neville Sweijd, who's going to give us some insights on this. Dr. Sweijd, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. What would you say are the key climatological disasters that we as a country are particularly vulnerable to, and how are these events intensified or evolved in recent years due to climate change?
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. Well, I want to say that South Africa is not unique in the sense that we are vulnerable to quite a variety of different kinds of disasters emanating from weather or extreme weather and extreme climate. So we have the full gambit of floods, fires, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, storm surges. There are many different kinds of ways in which these extreme events manifest. What is special about South Africa is that we have a very varied climate. So that means we have very different kinds of seasons. The winter, for example, in the northeast is quite different to the winter in the Western Cape, as you are probably aware. So we have winter rainfall down in the Western Cape, and in the north right now there are brush fires happening because it's very dry up in the north. So South Africa is quite unique in the sense that we have quite a regional variety of different hazards, shall we say. But as a whole, right around the globe, we are subject to the same sort of set of different kinds of extremes. What is important, though, is what's happening with these extremes, which are trending. And this is a global phenomenon, and they are trending in intensity, meaning there are different ways in which they trend. One of them is the frequency, how often we get them. The other is, for example, how long they last. That's the duration. Sometimes we have aseasonal weather. Sometimes they are much stronger in their force, if you like. And then sometimes it's really the impact that varies quite substantially. So there are different ways in which these kinds of extreme events vary and are intensifying in the broad sense that they are happening more frequently and more intensely. I think also it's important to note that extreme weather comes from extreme climate, and extreme climate is itself a phenomenon. It doesn't always mean that we have a disaster, but so sometimes a disaster is avoidable even if the weather is extreme. And that is really all about managing these different kinds of things. I think the final point here is that South Africa does have some special vulnerabilities. We're quite a dry country, ironically, in general. And so a drought is a particular worry in this part of the world, which is an ironic thing to say, given that at the moment we're quite wet. Yeah.
I mean, Doc, it's quite interesting that you say that in managing extreme weather, it doesn't always have to result in a disaster. Now, I just want us to unpack that a little bit in terms of the relationship between these disaster management agencies and climatologists and environmentalists. Do you find that we are working together in such a way that we are able to avert a disaster?
So one thing we can't do is control the weather, at least not yet. So trying to stop the event from happening is quite difficult. And it's a global problem that the climate is becoming more energetic. There's more variability in the climate. And this is a broader climate change problem, which is, of course, manageable with mitigation of carbon emissions. But that's really a bigger global problem. Right now, we have to be realistic and accept the fact that extreme events are happening and are happening more frequently and intensely. So what we can try to do is prepare for them. And it's really in the preparation, in the adaptation to these extreme events that we can try to do what's called disaster risk reduction. And that's a series of different actions, which does involve very many different role players and stakeholders, right across the board, including the climate scientists. But very importantly, there's policy that's required. There's local municipalities, communities, stakeholders of all kinds have to come together. And we are in fact, making good progress in this regard. But that doesn't mean we were able to stop either of these events from occurring, nor from having impact. It's really a question of trying to reduce that impact and anticipate these events better and prepare for them better, that we can reduce the impacts of them.
So, Doc, in trying to reduce, what innovative approaches or technologies do you advocate for in managing climatological disasters, and how do these solutions contribute to building resilience and sustainability in the affected regions?
Yeah, that's a question with a very long answer, but I'll try and be succinct. It depends on what part of the process you're really considering here. From a climate point of view, I think the most important thing is that we have to understand, try to predict with what we call early warning systems, trying to understand what the likelihood of a particular season is to some particular threat. So, for example, in the last few years, we've had El Niños and we've had La Niñas. Now, these are global climatological events, but they have a particular impact on the type of weather that we experience on a seasonal basis in South Africa. So that gives us an idea of what we are likely to expect. And then at the short range, there are different kinds of climate models that are applied to identifying particular kinds of risks at particular scales. We might say, for example, in the Western Cape, we expect heavy rainfall in the next 24 hours. And so we can do impact-based forecasting to try to warn our society of what is likely to happen. That's one kind of technology, is the climate science. But there are other kinds of technologies where we can map out, for example, the way in which water flows or where people are located in low-lying areas. And there's lots of different kinds of data that we can assemble to try and understand how risk and vulnerability to these different kinds of extreme events is distributed. And that requires really important collaboration. The key issue here is data, trying to get information and data about where those vulnerabilities are. Those might be vulnerabilities to people, they might be vulnerabilities to particular kinds of crops which affect food security. It might be vulnerability towards transport, for example, which rivers we expect to come down and flood and might damage infrastructure and roads. So there are lots of ways in which we can understand what the likely impacts are going to be and try and give forewarning. And then the other application of technologies is really to try and understand what kind of infrastructure should be constructed and how we channel, for example, water flow in order to prevent flooding or at least reduce the impact of these events. So there are different kinds of ways in which technologies can be applied. But I should also add that there are aspects of not just preparedness, but during operations, when there is flooding or there is heat waves or other hazards, precisely what we need to do at the time and after the event to try and reduce the long-term impacts of these kinds of events. So there's very many different ways in which different kinds of technologies can be applied to the whole process.
Most certainly. Doc, I think lastly, Doc, how do you think we should be engaging with policymakers and researchers and other advocacy groups in order to advocate for climate resilient policies? I mean, investments in infrastructure, in the technology that you speak of now, and just in the sustainable development practices that we should have in the country.
Yes, so responding to extreme events is one thing. There are many other longer-term problems that we need to, and challenges that we need to respond to. And I think that there is growing awareness. It's interesting that extreme events are really a kind of expression or manifestation of climate change. Extreme events are natural. They always happen to some degree, but it is this intensification of these extreme events that's important. And that raises awareness, which does give us an opportunity to try and develop the systems, which of course then require the policy frameworks to implement. So I think that we are getting more and more organized right across the board, including government and the government agencies like the National Disaster Management Center and various other agencies are talking to each other. We recently had a conference to try to organize ourselves better around this. And we do have policy frameworks. We have, for example, something called the National Framework for Climate Services. These are designed in such a way that they can consult with the people who are most affected by these extreme events to ensure that the science that's done on the other end is really an appropriate science to bring the right kind of information to bear to manage these events. So I'd say there are processes, but it's really important that what all businesses, communities, and other people, all citizens who are affected by this, really think about the ways in which they are individually vulnerable, themselves and their businesses and their homes and their dwellings, and really understand and learn about what are the real threats and what are the things that they can do to minimize the impact of these growing threats.
Most certainly, Doc. Thank you so much for your time. It's very heartwarming to know that we are making headway in terms of how we are responding to these disasters. And as you say, it's very important for communities to also be educated and to be aware in terms of how they also respond. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights this morning. That was Director at the Alliance for Collaboration on Climate and Earth System Science, Dr. Neville Sweijd.